ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
My Brilliant Career tells the story of a passionate, imaginative, headstrong girl who's coming of age on a failing family farm in the 1890s. But despite her precarious circumstances, she refuses the offer of marriage made by a rich and handsome man. Her life is not easy, but she is absolutely determined to keep it her own. My Brilliant Career draws strongly on the life of its author, Miles Franklin. The novel was published when Miles was only 21 years old and was a huge sensation. Girls and women wrote to Miles from all over Australia saying that they saw themselves in her heroine. There was another burst of love for My Brilliant Career when it was made into a film directed by Gillian Armstrong and starring the young Kerrie Davies and Sam Neill. While Miles's name lives on in our most prestigious literary award, the Miles Franklin, and her first given name, Stella, has been reclaimed in the Stella Prize for Writing by Australian women. But what most of us don't know is that there is a hidden chapter in the life of Miles Franklin. After the success of her debut novel, Miles disappeared. She went undercover as a servant girl with the aim of reporting on what life was really like for the thousands of women making their living as poor slaveys, as housemaids were called. After her year undercover, Miles then headed to America, arriving in San Francisco just after the cataclysmic earthquake of 1906. She then established herself in Chicago, where she became part of a radical group of free-thinking and independent women. Kerrie Davies has traced these hidden years in her new book, Miles Franklin, Undercover. Hi, Kerrie.
Hello. How are you, Sarah?
I'm so happy to be hearing this amazing part of Miles Franklin's life, of which I had absolutely no idea. I mean, she became famous at 21, as I say, because of My Brilliant Career. Why did people react to it so strongly?
Her voice is so strong, it's so feisty, it's so passionate. You know, she talks about breasts beating strongly and passionate hearts and so feisty. I could see why it was such a breakthrough. And women wrote to her all over the country, young women going, oh, you're saying what I'm feeling. And she just was such the zeitgeist. So she really captured that sense of, I want my own choices. I don't want babies in the bush. That's just not the life for me. What else is there?
So was it a success right away once it was published?
It's so often the case that you receive a lot of attention as a writer and everyone's giving you accolades, but actually I think people were talking about the book more so than buying it, or they wanted to buy it, and I actually think this is actually true. They wanted to buy it, but because of the colonial situation where they didn't send out enough copies to Australia as well.
Was it published in the UK?
It was published in the UK. She was called the Charlotte Bronte, of Australia, and she was internationally being discussed. So I do think there was demand for it, but she was very frustrated in that if there were copies, it was hard to get. And then also she had a terrible royalty deal because it was export, colonial, because her publisher was actually based in Edinburgh. The backstory to that is Henry Lawson. She basically cold wrote to Henry Lawson saying, will you look at my book? He, one dreary afternoon, had a look and said, are you man or woman? And she said she was, a young woman, but she did not want to be known as such. There was no publisher interest in Australia, which would be a continuing frustration for her. I think George Robertson was away. The publisher, George Robertson, said it was a great mistake not to publish it. But long story short, Henry Lawson took the book to his publishers and his agent, and it was published by Blackwoods in Edinburgh.
So it became the source of a lot of discussion, and she became famous, but she didn't make a lot of money out of it.
No, she didn't. She did not.
So you said, Kerrie, that there were young women all over the country writing to her saying, you're expressing how I feel about myself and my future. Who else was interested in her? Because there was a lot of famous Australian figures at that era who also became quite obsessed with the figure of Miles Franklin.
So there was this stream of letters coming to their drought-ridden property in Stillwater, and she talks about the postman delivering everything to their kerosene tin box if he was not too drunk to deliver it. And and he'd also have a look, apparently. So among all those fan letters of women just saying, you are me, there was letters from Rose Scott, who with the messiest handwriting ever was like, oh, I lived your book with you.
And who was Rose Scott?
Rose Scott was like the main suffragette of Australia. She was a powerhouse of women's rights, very charming. She would have Friday salons that had lots of the literary and the elite, but also she would invite people from other walks of life. So she was a very influential figure and particularly pivotal to the women's rights movement around the 1900s, like Vita Goldstein as well, who she'd also become friends with. And then there was also like letters written from the Australian Club, because you can tell on the letter, because it's got the letterhead, the stamp, from A.B. Patterson, or I call him the man from Snowy River.
And so what sort of fame did he have at that time, A.B. Patterson, Banjo Patterson? He'd already written The Man from Snowy River.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he'd written The Man from Snowy River. He was also an acclaimed war reporter. His war reporting is just so good. Like, it's just so descriptive, and the beats of it as well. He says, don't look at them, they are dead. So, he was on the circuit as well. So he was doing lots of speaking tours. He was a celebrity writer for the Herald. He had handmade suits. He would go riding with Norman Lindsay, who admired his style and said he was very reserved but elegant and witty. So she was basically getting feted by the best of the best at the time.
And he was older than her.
Yes, he was nearly 40, I think.
And she was 21 or so. And so what's
21, 22.
They began writing to each other. What kind of relationship developed between Banjo and Miles?
Well, there was a bit of a flirtation, perhaps more than a flirtation. So it started because she wanted legal advice, and he was a lawyer as well as a writer and an editor. So through a mutual friend, he found out that she was seeking advice. And then so he writes to her from the Australian Club saying, I will help you. I have heard of you. I haven't read your book yet, but I've heard of you. And then they meet at this cafe, and they start, oh, your letter and I must have crossed. I wish you were here. Come and see my etchings.
Literally, come and see my etchings.
Yeah, along those lines. I've just bought some fine paintings.
So did they have a romantic relationship, you
Yes,
think?
They think that the slap scene in, there's a slap scene in the first draft of the sequel to My Brilliant Career that was not published, and she's asleep and she wakes up. And then she slaps, because he's obviously a kiss while she's asleep on the couch in his apartment. So they definitely had more than a flirtation, and he wanted her to come on a cruise on the South Pacific that he was going to be writing and reporting on. And she was like, oh, I can't really come, but should I dress up as your valet? She was very flirty.
He wanted to collaborate with her too, so he must have admired her as a writer as well as a young woman.
Yes, he did, from a point that I can do all the thrills and you can do all the emotion. So
that was the proposal.
And his sister tried to broker it. Like, his sister thought this would be an excellent collaboration. I think she was quite keen to see them together and thought that they would make a great partnership. And there was definitely chemistry between them. When you've got chemistry with someone, so you can feel the chemistry in the letters, and she kept everything, thankfully. Her letter archive is just so thick because she kept all the fan letters, she kept everything from A.B. Patterson, all the later letters in life, all the ones from her family. So it was to capture her voice and his voice, and he gets very frustrated going, I just think it's just dribble, and I wish you were here to sort of cast your eye over it. So he did want a collaboration, but she just went, that sounds like he's going to take me over. And her sister, who she was very close to, said, sounds like he wants wants you to do the work and he wants the attention. So he wants the success.
His sister was in favour, but Miles' sister was cautious about what it would mean for Miles if she collaborated with this much famous older male author. So that flirtation relationship is happening while she's a young woman, and she also spends time in Sydney and stays with Rose Scott, this famous wealthy suffragette that you mentioned. What was her time like staying at Rose's place? What did she get up to there?
Rose is an influential figure, but at times a little overwhelming, I think, for Miles. And I think she kind of almost claimed her as, this is my spirit child. That's what she called Miles. And I think that Miles really admired her and loved her almost in a kind of mother-daughter kind of way, because Rose was much older than her. But Rose definitely presented her at salons and made sure that she met influential and wealthy people and would do anything for her. She could have just stayed hanging out with Rose. She never had to look after herself, but she's such an independent person and was very wary of being claimed by man or famous suffragette. As wonderful as she appreciated those people, she had such a strong sense of, I want to realise myself. I don't want to be beholden to anyone. So she kind of sensed that she would almost get subsumed by Rose, I think. So there was a little bit of frustration on Rose's part that Miles would periodically go and disappear, and she'd go, where is she? Where's my spirit child?
Was she writing another novel after the success of My Brilliant Career?
She always wrote. She said she wrote in a fever. So she wrote what was then called The End of My Career, which was the sequel to My Brilliant Career, My Career Goes Bung, which was published much later, like decades later.
Why wasn't it published at the time?
Because, as George Robertson said, it was okay to make fun of country bumpkins, but not the better class. So she basically satirised her time with Rose, and even though she'd use pseudonyms and talk about, it was clearly Rose Scott, having dresses, they're wobbling like white puddings. Her breasts were wobbling like white puddings, and it's just like, oh, wow, you could imagine. So he very kind of wary of Darlinghurst Jail and defamation, because you could go to jail if you didn't pay your fines, and it was a criminal offence at that time. So he was like, absolutely not. He said it was great fun, appreciated her sense of humour.
But
so
they didn't
really
want to publish it.
No. He was like, this is too dangerous. Stop it. Just don't take such risks.
So after My Brilliant Career, she'd made these sort of new influential, wealthy friends in the literary world of Sydney at the time. How did Miles Franklin get the idea to go undercover as a household servant?
It's such an arc, isn't it, within 2 years? So it is this struggle. So she kept writing. She had another book that she wrote, which later became Cockatoos. And she just kept in this fever. But then she was running out of money, and her parents had been forced off the farm to go to Penrith, which at the time was like a country town outside Sydney. And I think she was just looking into the future, just going, I don't want to get married. Have you found anyone you like better than yourself?
Is that what the grandma
all the bachelors
asked?
are still thinking about you around the southern New South Wales district. And she just thought there must be another way. So she could, like I said before, have just hung out with Rose Scott, and which would have been the easier option. And, we all know people like that just give a little to their rich friends who give a lot back and have that almost like a patron. So instead, she was influenced by undercover journalists who were breaking into the front page by the virtue of the fact that they were women, so they had to work harder at the time to make a splash, literally. So there was a trend in the United States and then got to London. They were called stunt girl reporters, or what we would call, I guess, because of Hunter S. Thompson in the 70s, gonzo. So you would go undercover, you would take a huge risk to your safety. The most famous is Nellie Bly, who went to the New York Women's Asylum because Pulitzer said, go in, we've heard it's really bad, just be hysterical, get yourself admitted, we'll come and get you in 10 days, which thankfully he did. So that caused a huge stir. So it was, it was at times dangerous, and there was American journalist who went to London and she worked undercover as a servant. She left her poodle Judge with a friend. I love that her poodle was called Judge. I just love these details of people's lives. And so she left Judge and worked, and that caused a big splash as well. And then her autobiography came out around 1903, and the timing of it suggests that Miles was influenced by that and said, well, I can do an Australian version of that. And at the time, the servant question was such a huge debate because all the girls were going to the factories, and it was like, where can we get good servants? You're like, well, who would have had servants? Only rich people. No, it was from pretty much middle class onward, you were expected to have a servant. It was like a designer bag. It was a status symbol.
And I guess, household work was so much more laborious just in terms of the labour involved in cooking and cleaning, washing, all done by hand. Washing,
the mangle,
of course.
for hours. Yeah, so definitely it was a lot more laborious as well. Like, we didn't have the machines, but it was also status as well. So there was this, where are all the good servant girls? And the servant girls would be like, well, if you treated us better
and paid us better, we would stay. So Miles thought, well, this is a win-win situation. I can work as a servant. I can research my next book. So she decided to try nonfiction, given the last two fiction hadn't flown. And we'll see how we go. And I can also have a roof over my head so I don't have to live at home with my parents, constantly nagged at to get married. And have an adventure, which seems to be part of the character that she had, was here's something interesting to do. So where did she find a job to start with?
Well, it's interesting you were saying about, the adventure, because I dedicate the book to all women like Miles, well, all people like Miles who take risks over security, because that's what she constantly did. And that's what I love most about her. I just love that she would go, well, this sounds fun, or we'll see how this works out. And I relate to that because I'm a bit like that myself and very experiential. So I think with Miles, so with the undercover, she then went and started kind of exploring it into how she could actually do this. Her family were horrified, so she obviously didn't tell many people. She said it was okay to be a nurse or a governess, but to be a servant arised considerable horror among my circle. So even her dad, that I think she gets her kind of risky experiential from, was, no, this is not a good idea. But of course she went and did it anyway. So she only confided into the Minister for Work's wife, the O'Sullivans, and they were very much into fair wage and fair work. So she confided and then got the magical reference. She said, Mrs. O'Sullivan acted fairy.
So she had met this establishment family through Rose Scott, through those circles, and she gets a reference from her.
Yes, which starts her off.
And where was her first position?
Her first position was actually in Sydney. So she tried the newspapers first. So in the Sydney Morning Herald, they were going through looking, wanted servant. It's like, I want a clean and sober girl, and it'd be in capitals. It was clean, sober, polite. She said she had the newspapers in hand and was looking around, but every door was kind of slammed in her face. And she was like, really? Is there such demand for servants? People seem fine. So then she went into what was called a registry office, which is essentially an employment agency for servant work. And from there she goes to the eastern suburbs of Sydney and works in like a terrace house, which is still there, amazingly for Sydney, which, has renovated and destroyed so much architecture. It is still there. It is now apartments, but the building's there. And actually the woman that owned the apartments lived next door, and she let me have a look inside.
And I guess, of course, back in the early 1900s, what famous people look like wasn't well known the way it is now. So people might know the name but not have any idea of what she actually looked like. She could be working as a maid in your house and you not be aware of that. She would just look like any other young woman.
She was, and she thought it was hilarious when someone threw her, this lady came to the boarding house that she worked at. She worked at a posh boarding house in the North Shore of Sydney in Kirribilli. and, threw her a coat, and she'd met her at Government House. And then she'd overhear people talking about my brilliant career while she was serving them. And yeah, so definitely there was no Instagram, and there were photographs, but it was such a big deal to have a photograph taken, like to go literally into a studio. It was a special event. So yes, you could get away with a lot more with your face. There was no iPhones.
So she did stints at different places in this year as an undercover maid. She started at this house in Waverley, and then she went to the boarding house in Kirribilli.
Yes.
Is it still there? Can you still see that place?
It is. So I did a few little wanders, and I didn't expect to find it because it's right near the Harbour Bridge, and half that street actually was taken off by the bridge. So I was very surprised and delighted. It's still sitting there. It's luxury apartments, as everything in Sydney is. Anywhere near the harbour has been turned into a luxury apartment. It's still there. I couldn't get inside, but you could see the building and the little love seat down near the harbour, and imagine her there in the frangipani and the windows.
So she worked there, of course, alongside other maids. Mm-hmm. Did any of the other girls guess that there was more to this? She called herself Sarah Franklin when she was undercover. Did anyone else guess that there was more to Sarah Franklin than met the eye?
They would sort of be curious about her. So definitely there was this curiosity about her going, you're not normal. Like, even the way she spoke. Yeah. I mean, because even though her family her grandmother was wealthy, as shown really well in the film, but she was sort of cultured poor, so educated, and that was something that came out in her voice. And so she did actually confide in one of the other maids that she'd become very close to, and she also shared this tiny little room with her, and she said she's going to see me writing in the diary every night, so I'm just going to tell her. And she said, I knew that you weren't just some common slavey. You can stand up for all the servant girls. So she was so supportive of it. But the boarding house, so it sounds like it would be grim, but it's actually really posh. And so it was full of sort of wealthy people drifting between residences or wealthy tourists. And it actually was the base for some British naval officers. One of them was also very curious about her as well, because she'd make Shakespeare banter in the dining table that she called the zoo. They called it the zoo, and I had a vision of, animal. She said one's like the sharks, the donkey, the giraffe, and I had this vision of sort of, giraffe head and shark head and eating, that sort of anthropomorphic kind of scene. And people would confide, but nobody actually knew until the bulletin right at the end.
So she did this for a whole year. Did she go to any sort of very wealthy, fancy houses in that time?
She did in Toorak particularly, and also in Sydney.
So she went to Melbourne as well?
She went to Melbourne as well, but just before she went to Melbourne, and after some tragedy in the family, she went and worked at the, this is the highest profile, Richard O'Connor, who was a senator and High Court judge, who kind of shepherded the women's franchise bill through the women's vote. So she worked in her house and the cook. There was the cook and her and maybe there was maybe another maid, but it was quite a small staff for such a large house. And that's still there as well. That's called Keston, which is also now apartments. But I think it was ASIO at one stage.
Really?
It's got the most fascinating history, that building. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Did Miles, when she was writing about these different experiences, did she prefer working in those grand houses than the more middle-class ones, or how was the experience different for her?
I think she liked the company because she was very anxious, but she was also, known as a gregarious person, extrovert. She was very flirty and funny, and she just had a very kind of exuberant personality, but she also was internally very, very anxious. So she very much preferred those houses that had staff, that she could make friends with the other people as well. And there was more of a characters coming through. I think she found it quite isolating, and that's why she ended up being all flirty with the tradies and the smaller houses, because it was just so lonely.
Are there any photos of her at that time, Kerrie? Did she take any photos of herself in character?
She did. And the other maids were like, don't go out in your maid's uniform, don't let everyone see you as a common slavey. And she wanted to document the experience. She was smart. She knew that having the photo. So
what did she look like in the photo?
She had the little parlour maid's outfit on. Like, she was very much like a long sort of black dress with like white apron and a little parlour hat in her hair. And she's kind of like cheeky. And I think it was probably for the photographer because, it would have been it was in a Melbourne studio actually, I think, when she actually got it done, that she would have been the first maid he'd ever photographed. He probably thought, oh, she's just playing dress up, So it would have been quite curious, I think, for the photographer. But yeah, she kept those photos and she sent it to the editor of the Bulletin when there was rumours starting to go around, and this was towards the end. And he says, I've heard what you're doing, and will you write about it as a letter? And so she goes, oh, I've got a photo, and she sent it to him, and he goes, oh, very seductive. And I was like, oh, ew.
Ew. Ew. She sent a copy of that photo to her grandma as well. Was that being deliberately provocative, do you think?
She was. I think she
grandma react. Her grandma who wanted to get married.
Her grandmother reminded me of Violet in Downton Abbey, just this really witty, intimidating woman who just looked after everyone and ultimately wanted the best for everyone as well.
We should have been tearing her hair out at the thought that this granddaughter is off unnecessarily working as a maid in Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah,
and then having a photograph taken of it. I mean, the outrage.
She was just like, will you calm down? When are you ever going to calm down? And I've heard you talking about going to New Zealand, and how can you do this? And she was called Stella by her, which is, her first name, which the Stella Prize is named after. Stella.
So after this year or so undercover in these different houses and different kind of establishments working as a maid, she's done all this writing, all of this note-taking. What happened to all of that material, that manuscript that she put together?
Oh, I kind of grieved for her because she disappeared again, much to Rose Scott's frustration. She went up to the Blue Mountains and stayed with some friends there and wrote. And she wrote it up and she goes, I'm going to call it Mary Ann, because that was the slang for what servants were called at the time. You were Mary Anning. It was, it was a verb. So she did that, and then she, of course, sent it off. And yes.
It got rejected.
It got rejected.
Why?
Because she hadn't taken the advice the first time around of not making fun of the better class. And this is hard to know because perhaps there is a more polished draft. Perhaps this is the one that's in the State Library of New South Wales. It's over 100,000 words. She changes point of view halfway through as well. She starts off in I and then almost becomes Mary Ann, the character. So as you were saying before, she actually was known to her employers as Sarah Franklin, but she called herself Mary Ann in the manuscript to try and distance herself. But it did not get any take-up whatsoever, and largely probably because of defamation, perhaps because of the narrative problems in it.
So would she have felt that she'd wasted this whole year of living undercover and making all these notes and writing up this manuscript?
I wonder if she thought she had wasted it, or whether she, like any writer, I'm going to turn this into something else. And it's really interesting in the process of this book, I actually did try to publish the manuscript first. It's Miles Franklin's work. And so I found the manuscript after this one wonderful line that just sent me down 5 years of research. So I found the manuscript, transcribed it, wrote kind of an introduction to it. So very much a straightforward, traditional, unpublished manuscript presentation for the first time. And it was like, no, because of the same reasons, the narrative problems, and also it was of its time. So that was pretty gutting. And I was like, oh, poor Miles. I felt bad for Miles. I felt like I'd let her down. Like, I feel like I talk to her sometimes. So I'm like, Miles, we're going to the ABC today to talk to Sarah about conversations. And, I'm sure you'd love it.
Well, you didn't rest. You didn't let that rejection be the end of this story.
No.
And so I'm sure Miles would be grateful. If we go back to the point in Miles' life wherein this manuscript hasn't been accepted, her grandma's pressuring her to get married. She's pretty much broke. What did she decide to do in 1906?
Well, so this was a couple of years after the rejection, and she'd actually turned to journalism at that time and written another novel, which was seen as too feminist. So there was a lot of anti-feminism going on at the time as well. So she kept moving. She just kept moving. It was quite extraordinary. I mean, moving emotionally, moving artistically, and then, as you say, moving physically. Because while most people went to London, to the mother country, to home, she decided that she would go to the States. She was influenced by Vida Goldstein, who'd been over there for, suffragette conferences. So Vida Goldstein, the Australian suffragette and feminist. And she just kind of became entranced with the idea of the United States. So she was making money this time as a journalist, so that's why she could afford to go. She was writing columns for the Sydney Morning Herald, not about being a servant, but about country boys coming to the city for work and, riding musters in the snowy mountains. So she jumps on a ship and leaves broken hearts and grandmother going, oh, God.
What now?
What now? What?
And what happened? What had happened just before she arrived in San Francisco?
Well, there was an incident, as they call it, an earthquake, just the most pulsating pavement earthquake, the earthquake of 1906 in San Francisco. And she first heard about it when they sailed into Hawaii. And they sort of picked up some frantic locals there trying to get to San Francisco, either back to their own property to see what was happening or for family and friends. The whole city had been completely levelled, and also the fires. So it wasn't the earthquake caused the initial damage, but what caused the main scale of the damage was just the towering fires. And
so it was a scene of real, complete devastation.
It was total devastation. There was fires everywhere. There was people. So many people lost their homes. She said had become classless. Like men in suits were dragged off to do haul logs. She was so worried about the horses because she's such a horse lover. The horses getting basically whipped into exhaustion because there were no trams anymore.
And did she stay there, Kerrie, or what did she do once she'd arrived where she was planning to be, but seeing this complete natural disaster? What did she do?
Well, she first of all wrote about it. She knows a story when she sees it, so she wrote about it for the Sydney Morning Herald, and that's a compelling piece of eyewitness of the aftermath. So she did have a great eye. But she was going to go to New York, but the person that she was connected to was Vida Goldstein in New York had left for Europe. So they said, well, what about Chicago? And again, she went, okay, because they said you can stay at Hull House. And Jane Addams, who quite famous, there's buildings everything named after her in the States, a social justice reformer, and who had this building called Hull House in Chicago, where at a Jane Club where other women could go and stay.
Where did she find work? What was she doing to earn a keep? Was she still writing?
So she gets this wonderful train journey across, which she chronicles. And then so she stayed briefly with the feminists at Hull House, and also that was more of a temporary spot. So then she befriended Alice Henry there. So Alice Henry is another famous Australian suffragette feminist who, like Miles, had gone to the States, and they connected. But I don't think Alice didn't realise who she was because Miles introduced herself as Stella. So she kind of wanted to forget my brilliant career. She'd really had enough. She was like, this is my whole new life. And so she wasn't going on, I'm Miles Franklin, I wrote my brilliant career. She was like, this is my new life and I'm Stella.
She was still undercover a little bit.
Essentially, yeah. So Alice Henry sort of befriended her, and then she went and lived with Alice Henry a bit and worked in department stores, and she still wanted to publish. She brought the manuscript with her. She hadn't given up on it, the Marianne manuscript.
What was happening politically in Chicago at that period of the early 1900s?
Well, originally I was going to stop the book just around her sailing for the States, but I just got so captivated by that time in Chicago, and I had it was earlier than The Great Gatsby, but it had that heaving kind of New York city sense of social unrest and pushing for workers' rights in the factories, especially for the women. It was the biggest city in the world, or among the biggest cities in the world. There was the stockyards, that was the biggest abattoir. There was a book called The Jungle that was actually also based on undercover journalism. It became a novel about working in the stockyards, and I read it and I was vegan for a month. So she was just in this centre of the world. I mean, everyone thinks London was the centre of the world, but she was like, no, this is where it is. And she was just also meeting them. They called them the millionaire Reds, or these like millionaire socialists, and who were just all fighting for rights. And it must have been incredibly empowering and exciting. And
she was, of course, writing letters back home and receiving news from home. And she got some terrible news about her beloved sister. What had happened in 1907?
Oh, well, she lost her sister. And that was just so sudden. Just lost her sister really suddenly. And she was like, that wasn't supposed to happen. And, you know, her sister had just sort of was settling into married life, because the sister was like in the film, the sister was the gentle good one. You know, when you've always got the good sister and you're the black sheep of the family. So, yeah, and that just completely destroyed her.
She'd already lost, I think, 2 other siblings, which of course was common in that era. But this sister, as you say, was the one that was her sort of heart's friend, and they had this real closeness. And so to get that news so far away was devastating.
By letter.
How did she take it?
Well, she ended up in hospital, and at the time, the standard treatment for depression or nervous collapse or neurothesia, as it was called at the time, and I think I completely pronounced that wrong. But it was called the milk treatment, and that was where basically women were just fed milk and in a room. No stimulation.
So the idea was that they were overexcited and needed to be calmed down with milk.
With milk, unless they were overweight, and then they had half milk. They had skim milk.
So this is what was recommended to Miles? Did she follow that?
Well, she wasn't really in a state to make any recommendations for herself. It was a really deep place, and I think it had been coming for a while, and I think that all that sort of moving on with all that disappointment, I think that was getting stored up emotionally for her. Linda's death kind of brought to a climax all the turbulence of the years before. So luckily she had wonderful friends, and they just looked after her. They went, oh, no, we're not doing that. Jane Addams had already been on the milk treatment as a younger as well, and so she was like, that's not happening. So her and Alice Henry decided to send them to the millionaire Reds at this little town called Winnetka outside Chicago. And it's beautiful. It looks like a Ralph Lauren ad now. I went there because I went to Chicago to research it all and met the librarian of the historical house there. And they just made sure she was okay. They just let her come back to life in her own time, and, you know, with lots of books and
so she didn't take that advice of no intellectual stimulation?
No, and I think her friends wouldn't have let her do that, because they know that would have been death to her.
So she just rested and had the space to grieve, I guess.
Had the space to grieve, and I think that's so important. And, you know, and she became friends with the millionaire Red that I keep calling, his name is actually William Lloyd. His wife, Lola Maverick Lloyd, she was also into women's rights, and she had the young kids, and she later becomes much more influential around World War I, but they became friends, and Lola's diaries are actually in the New York Public Library, which I went and looked at as well, and, you know, they wrote letters to each other, so some of that was in the New York Public Library. You know, you could see their friendship forming from this real place of grief. But from that, Miles had been recommended to the head of the Women's Trade Union League at the time, Chicago, and she wanted a secretary to sort of get overwhelmed with her letters and correspondence. So she wrote to Miles sort of offering her a job. And by this time, Miles had actually picked up some typing and stenographer skills as well. In Chicago, going to night school, because she'd realised very clearly that she wasn't ever going to make money from writing to sustain herself. I mean, even Banjo Patterson, had a job as a side hustle, as the kids call it, as an editor. And he was probably the most famous writer in Australia at the time. So she had decided very pragmatically she would need a job. Then she didn't want to go back to doing servant work. And she worked as a secretary and then became at the centre of women's rights women's working rights in Chicago, which is just the most extraordinary time.
So is this a happy period in her life, those years in Chicago?
I think it's a place of growth. I think at times she would get struck by severe homesickness and the grieving for her family and her sister. But I think it was a huge time of growth into it really was a second age for her, so a second coming of age. So these years, I call it the real life sequel to My Brilliant Career, because in a way all these years is what really formed her. I think she had some wonderful times there. I think she had some exciting times. I think she was in constant stimulation of choir and parties and theatre, like the Fine Arts Museum there. Just constantly, it was one of the biggest cities in the world, but sometimes she would need quiet and she would write at night. And the fireworks used to drive her mental, like around Independence Day, she thought was insanity because they'd let off fireworks and guns. It was just crazy. And she was like, this is just insanity. So at times she would need quiet. And then she would go often to go see Lola because it was this beautiful, secluded, safe place for her. So it did get too much. But she kept writing. She grew as a person.
In your study of these sort of hidden years of Miles Franklin's life, Kerrie, it seems like men just kept falling in love with her. Like from
yes.
one of the milkman at one of the houses she was at in Sydney to the doctor who treated her when she had this nervous collapse.
He proposed.
He seemed to keep...
Lost his job over it, apparently. She was like, really?
Keep getting proposals. Did she ever come close to marrying?
I think she had feelings for some of her students. Like, I think she definitely had that chemistry with Patterson. I think she definitely had some love-struck suitors that she tolerated or she had feelings for, but she could never kind of take that next step. And, like, there's a quote it's on the back of the book saying that before I could be happy in love, I had to realise myself. And I think she really realised herself in Chicago, to answer your last question. That's when she really realised herself. And she just decided to live a life that she would put writing first, that marriage was a choice. It didn't be something that she would be told to do or feel she had to do. And she would have these relationships with men. I think she had very strong boundaries. She was very moral. She came out of that social purity feminism movement. Didn't really agree with drinking. And she enjoyed the company of men and was very flirtatious. And she was a little pocket rocket. She was beautiful and charming and funny and smart. So they just were captivated by her. But as she told the millionaire, who I think was lining her up to be his mistress and perhaps second wife, I'm not your sport. So she really had those strong boundaries. So it's really, really interesting to kind of look at it. And I was just reading an article about this trend, and it's called boy sober or self-partnering. And I think self-partnering is probably the more elegant expression. And it was like, I'm going to be by myself. I'm not going to date.
Well, that is sort of, I guess, of course, what happens with the heroine of My Brilliant Career, where she refuses Harold Beecham.
Yes.
And so it was like she was setting a template for what it seems like she did in her own life.
Yes, she was Sibylla in that sense of I will write and I will put writing first. So she was decided that's what, to realise herself. And she also wanted the freedom to choose. And she could have married wealthy. She could have definitely married comfortably. But she always didn't want to be owned. And I think a lot of women can really relate to that, or claimed or controlled. A lot of women, a lot of people, in all sorts of relationships can relate to that. And it doesn't matter how much they love you and how much you love them, but you want your independence and you want to be able to follow your choices and your dreams. And she didn't want to be told, no, she can't go to the States and
take off on horseback.
Take off. Yeah. So the grandmother never got her dearest wish.
How did Australia's most famous literary prize come to bear Miles Franklin's name?
Well, this is really interesting because she wanted to leave her legacy to Australian literature and not having any children. So she gifted it to future writers. She wanted to see the continuation because she was so passionate about Australian literature. And that's how she ensured her legacy. And by that time, I think she had some modest savings. She'd had some success as well later in life with all that swagger. So it's sort of come at the later end of her life back into prominence again, because she was then back in Australia. And I think, her mother had a house. So there was money to us, and it's been very well managed over the years. And it's become synonymous with her, and it's exactly, I hope, as what she would have wanted. Some of our best novelists have won that prize.
It seems like she always had a really kind of good relationship to money. Like she was never under the sway of it. She was always wanting to use it for something more interesting, not just to kind of accumulate it or use it to help others.
Yeah, I mean, she loved accessories, definitely.
Accessories, obviously.
Like I do, like me. Like one of her friends was an heiress in Chicago who had this collection of fabulous hats that's in one of her journals. And so I had a vision of her handing on the hats. But yeah, she was very pragmatic. I think that came from her childhood as well. Like she hated waste. She abhorred gluttony, and I think that came from living in the drought. And she was always very careful with the money.
But still appreciated a good hat.
Yeah, and appreciated a good hat. So I think that's, a lesson to live by, really.
We're looking back at her life from a very different moment in history than her own. How do you see the choices that she made?
I thought about this a lot, and I think that a lot of her choices are really resonating now with women or anyone in a partnership, particularly young women, with the pressure to be a good wife, to be a good mother, to be a good, we can obviously have a career, very great, appreciative of that. But there is pressure to have roles, and going back to this idea of self-partnering. And so I think it's about embracing the choice, embracing the risk, and knowing that there's generations of women like Miles Franklin and all her contemporaries, like these women with awesome hats and hearts and, brains in Chicago behind you. We have your back. But it's hard to navigate those choices, and you do have to take risks for your own fulfillment sometimes. And it's hard. It's hard to leave the security net. So when I say risk, I'm not saying do risky things as in hurt yourself. I'm saying risk in taking a new career or writing that next book or going for that next challenge, and don't feel that to be held back, or don't feel who you have to be. You can break the status quo of your family, of society. And I think that's where these women were just so extraordinary, because it's hard enough now, let alone in the early 1900s where, you had grandmothers screaming at you to get married, though, that still happens. Definitely that still happens a lot, where you've got a lot of family pressure.
I think Miles would be really delighted with the story that you've written about her, Kerrie.
I hope so. I think because I would have loved to have had a good conversation with her as well, and just going, what do you think? And perhaps she would have, rewritten a book later of it. So I really hope she does. And I tried to put as much as her voice from the manuscript as I could. Like all the quotes are from her, and she's very funny. She's hilarious.
Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Thank you. It was so great talking to you.
Kerrie Davies was my guest on Conversations today, and Kerrie's book is called Miles Franklin, Undercover. Kerrie is also an academic at the University of New South Wales. This conversation was recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. Our executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Sarah Konoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Konoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.